In this class we're going to look at planning techniques. First and foremost, planning must start with looking at the environment, looking at the wider environment, the global situation, and looking at the specific market. In this case we'll start with the environmental scanning, as it's called, which is screening large amounts of information to anticipate and interpret changes in the environment. Businesses operate in a socio-political, technological environment. Business don't operate in a vacuum. So it's important to know what the local government and the national government are planning in terms of taxation and planning restrictions and help for business, as well as perhaps obstacles to business, or looking at their views of business, what they believe businesses should be doing. There are also trends in society, fashion trends and lifestyle changes taking place all the time. Some of them slowly, some of them very rapidly, but the business should be aware of these. So in other words, the business should be looking to the environment to see what is happening and be aware of what is happening. It's also important that the business understands the competitors, understands the market in which it's operating, looks at the competitors, their research and development, their new products, the marketing campaigns they're waging, understands competitors and understands that to survive it needs to take on the competitors and compete with them and effectively beat them at their own game, beat them and win the market, increase market share. It's also the case that businesses should be aware of global scanning. Global scanning is looking at the really wide effects. Let's say the government is looking to a different government, to another government, to establish trade patterns, perhaps with a country that previously there was no trade. Now, does that create opportunities for the business? It's necessary to know on the widest possible level what are the implications of widening trade. Will it mean cheaper imports from the other country? Will it mean investment opportunities overseas? What exactly does it mean? Now, there's certainly nothing that the company or the business can do about governments talking to each other and establishing trade patterns. The businesses, however, may see opportunities arising out of that. So the planning techniques that we're talking about sort of operate within these parameters. The need for environmental scanning, the need to understand the market, the need to understand the competitor, and the very broad global issues that affect the business. Now, the first technique we're going to briefly look at here is forecasting. Now, this is the subject of several other classes in other modules, so we're not going to labour the points here, but I just want to say that planning is involved in looking to the future, so we're to some extent overlapping with forecasting classes and forecasting material. So forecasting is the process of correct anticipations of future events or prediction of outcomes. Now, that's a fairly good definition of forecasting, but the word that stands out here is the future. The future is unknown. It's difficult to anticipate or to predict the future. The future, some economists would say, is unknowable, and that we can't see the future. So therefore forecasting is a very flawed exercise. It's guesswork. It's guesswork with figures to a large extent. We may have some idea of the probabilities of certain events arising, and there are classes about probability distributions which may emerge because we know that over a period of time certain patterns arises. So we might know what the likely distribution, the probability distribution will be, which will help us to make decisions. Or indeed we may face complete uncertainty, in which case we have no idea of what's going to happen in the future. We have to make decisions in the face of that uncertainty. One way or the other, dealing with the future is extremely complex. Having said all of that, as I just suggested, we have got forecasting techniques, be they good or bad, but we have got some. And these could be quantitative forecasting techniques. For example, forecasting that applies a set of mathematical rules to a series of past data to predict outcomes. The best example of this would be regression analysis in statistics, which is also the subject of other videos in other modules. But mathematical rules, regression techniques let's say, they're based on the assumption that past patterns will continue. They're based on the assumption that any trends in the past will continue into the future, which of course may not be the case. We also have qualitative forecasting. Forecasting that uses judgment and the opinions of knowledgeable individuals to predict outcomes. Sometimes businesses look to experts to try and get their opinions of what's likely to happen. But opinions can vary. Experts can differ. So it's difficult to work out exactly what's going to happen in the future. Now, forecasting effectiveness. Well, forecasting techniques are most accurate when the environment is not rapidly changing. If the environment is fairly constant, then we can have slightly more confidence in forecasting techniques. But if the environment is rapidly changing, that of course makes it very, very difficult. For example, in times of rapid technological change, as we're experiencing and have been experiencing for about the last 20 years and are likely to continue to do so into the foreseeable future, rapid technological change means the environment is changing, which makes it difficult to predict future demand, future trends, future patterns. So it makes it complicated. Forecasting is relatively ineffective in predicting unseasonable events as well, something which happens just out of the blue. It's difficult to predict this. For example, adverse weather conditions. Well, it just happened. Or forecasting changes in the stock market, rapid changes in the stock market, which periodically happen. So it can't cope with sudden changes. Forecasting techniques are not very good in these situations. It's always advisable, however, if possible, to use simple forecasting methods. Simple ones can be altered quite fast and they're easily understood. Economists use very complex forecasting methods in a subject called econometrics, which is very sophisticated techniques, usually surrounding regression and developments in regression analysis. But for business, probably simpler techniques would be most useful and easily applied and easily understood. It's always best not to rely on a single forecasting method. If the data can be collected and analysed and a trend worked out, perhaps that could be reinforced by some interviews, asking people what they are likely to do in the future. Now, I just said that this is very unreliable, but it's the best we've got. So we work with whatever we have. So if the same information comes back from the interviewees, as the trend is suggesting, we can be slightly more confident that the trend is accurate. But it's always best to try and use more than one method. This is sometimes called triangulation. In other words, we're trying to pick up the same data or the same information, if you like, using a variety of techniques to see if the findings all head in the same direction, all move in the same direction. Forecasting is a managerial skill. That's what managers do. They forecast. They use the data, and if they're accurate, they have been successful. If they're not accurate, the business suffers. And perhaps their career suffers as well. Another technique that's widely used when making decisions is break-even analysis. Now, this one properly rests in the area of finance, but in making decisions, the decision makers must try to determine how much of the product do they need to sell in order to break even. So even though it's a finance tool, it's relevant to us here in our discussion of planning. So it's dealt with in a separate set of classes, so I'm not going to go into it here, but it is important. It's important to find out how much must be sold in order to break even on the project before the project becomes profitable. Separate set of classes, so please go back to the finance notes, or there are classes in this area which will cover this topic. The next one is benchmarking. Well, this is a search for best practice amongst competitors or non-competitors that lead to superior performance. In other words, benchmarking is trying to compare the performance of the business with that of other businesses, assuming, of course, it gets the information on the other businesses to be able to conduct the benchmark. A benchmark is comparing. It's comparing one business's performance with another, looking at one business's investment against another business's investment. And there are steps in benchmarking. First of all, generally speaking, within the business, a benchmarking team needs to be formed. People with good backgrounds, good planning backgrounds, and also people with access to information. Then it's necessary to gather the internal information that's going to be benchmarked and try and get the external information. Now, getting the external information could be very, very difficult, particularly if there are private companies. Private companies don't have to publish their accounts. So gathering the internal information, it's possible, but the external information may be a real problem. But if benchmarking is to be successful, the two sets of information need to be compared. So it may be possible to get it, it may not. Once the information has been collected, if it was possible to collect, then of course the data is analysed to identify performance gaps. Compare the data and see where the data differs. And then prepare an action plan to address any gaps, to try and fix any shortfall. If it's found that the business is not performing as well as competitors when the benchmarking exercise has been done, then implement an action plan to try and fix the gap. So benchmarking is a widely used technique. It's attempted at least. The next technique we want to look at is that for allocating resources. And here there are really four types of resources that the business have access to. Financial financial techniques. For example, budgeting. They're also physical, looking at the physical assets of the business. So we have financial assets, the working capital, the cash in hand, the resources that are available, the financial resources that are available to the business. The physical one are the assets, the machinery, the furniture, the fixtures and fittings, and so on. Then we've also got human. The business may have spent a considerable sum on training its workforce. So the workforce are an asset of the business. Without the workforce, without their core competencies and their skills and their abilities, the business may not be in the position that it's in. There are also intangible assets, for example, goodwill or the intellectual property right over a certain process. Now, the tools and techniques for resource allocation, well, we'll do these briefly in the following slides. We'll start with budgeting. Now, this is a big topic considered in detail in finance classes, but we'll skip over it just to reintroduce it and put it back into your mind at this time. The budget is simply a numerical plan for allocating resources to specific activities. That's what it is. It's a numerical plan for allocating resources to specific activities. Now, the types of budget. Well, there's a variable budget, which takes into account the costs that vary in volume. In other words, if you're making something, the raw materials or the store's budget will be variable, because the more you make of the product, the more raw materials you need. So that would be variable. And many aspects of the business may have variable costs, costs that change as output changes. Then we have fixed budgets, assumes a fixed level of production. So for example, the business wants to make 100 items, it's fixed, 100. No more, no less. Now that may be a budget for that type of activity. Now there are many issues surrounding budgeting, and as I said, these are dealt with in detail in the finance classes. But you should be aware of the importance of budgeting in the context of planning, and that's all these couple of slides are doing. The next technique that we want to mention at this point is scheduling. And this is detailing, one, what activities have to be done. Scheduling sets out, in the planning process, what needs to be done. It also sets out the order in which they have to be completed. So in planning, it's necessary to say what has to be done and what sequence they have to be done in. What's the sequence? What's the plan? How should the activities be delivered? Which comes first? Which comes last? And also, who is to do what? Who is to do each? How are the resources allocated to each one? What departments are responsible for each activity, and who's responsible? And finally, when will they be completed? They must have a completion date, otherwise it'll drift on and on. So work must be scheduled, and that's important in the planning process. This is often caught up in what's known as a GANTT chart. It's a scheduling chart developed by Henry GANTT that shows actual and planned outputs over a period of time. A typical one may look something like that. Now there is specialist software that does this, but generally speaking that software is quite expensive, and unless there's extensive use made of the software, it's not worth purchasing. The return on the investment in the software is small. So many may use spreadsheets to develop a chart like this. Simply in a spreadsheet sheet, go across the top and set out, in this case, the time in months, and on the left hand side, in the left column, set out all the tasks. In this case it's A to L. And if you look at task B runs for 3 months. Task C runs for 1 month. So it's possible to schedule where the work has to be done and to make sure that the sequence is correct. So I'm not going to go into Gantt charts here either, but I'm just saying as a part of the planning process you should be familiar with Gantt charts and the whole idea of sequencing, because planning is to a large extent about sequencing and about the delivery of the product and about the whole scheduling issue. PERT is also another activity. This one is a flowchart diagram showing the sequence of activities needed to complete the project and the time and costs associated with it. It's again a technique I'm not going to go into in this session. There will be a video on this available for you to look at later, but there's a lot of information online about it. You should be really familiar with the term and what it does. It picks endpoints that represent the completion of the major activities. So it looks when the activities are needed. And the activities are the time of activities needed to progress from one event to another. That from is not spelled correctly, do apologize. And then we've also got slack time, the amount of time an individual activity can be delayed without delaying the whole project. And finally we have a critical path, which is the longest sequence of activities. This idea of PERT overlaps with critical path analysis. Again, there are videos on critical path analysis which you will have encountered in other modules. So as I said, I'm not going to go into it here. I just wish you to be aware that these scheduling techniques are available. Critical path is particularly important when we have decisions to make as to which route to take. Go route A or go route B. So the critical path is particularly important in conditions like that. So what I've done in this session is to really itemize out a lot of techniques, many of which will have been covered in other videos. But these techniques are all important in the context of planning. And it's planning that we're dealing with in this area. So it's important that you are aware that planning is a composite of many different types of topic. As I said, there are classes on those that you should be aware of and you should consult. There's also a lot of information online for you to look at. Simply go to business planning, type it into Google, and you'll be surprised at what comes up. That completes this session, so I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.